Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to, structure those really dense psychological ideas so you can integrate them faster. If you've been through the ringer with an intense relationship, you've probably looked at the cycle, right?
Oh,
Love bombing, the devaluation, discard. But today, we're going deeper, much deeper. We're moving past just the actions and looking at the actual, the architecture of the mind involved.
That's exactly it. Today's mission is a real structural deep dive. We're using Sam Vaknin's foundational work, which is frankly formidable, and blending it with the insights from mirrored psychic inversion theory, MPIT. The goal isn't just the what happened, it's the why. Why does it work like this? Specifically, the structural mechanics that almost guarantee that post-discard collapse survivors feel.
And here's the big idea, the insight we're really aiming for today. That feeling of absolute psychic annihilation after the discard. It's not just grief. It's way more than that. It's like the literal structural implosion of a reality you borrowed. You're not just hurting emotionally. You've actually become the host. You're housing the split, toxic internal stuff that narcissists couldn't handle themselves. It's like an internal contagion.
Yeah, structural contagion is a good way to put it, is how the narcissist's inner chaos gets transferred, almost like a blueprint, into the survivor's psyche. It's an ontological annihilation, really. And we have to see this. The narcissist is always in danger of collapsing internally. They need that external regulation. So when that regulation, you, the victim, is broken or discarded, you essentially inherit their pre-existing instability. We're looking at systems here, how one fractured system infects another. Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay, so starting right at the foundation, the narcissist mind, Vaknin says it's incredibly fragile, basically built on, nothing solid. What's holding their reality together?
It's fundamentally delusion-based. You have to trace the layers. Vaknin puts it perfectly. The whole narcissistic structure is founded on a delusion, right? Which is the false self. And that delusion, the false self, is founded on a fantasy of perfection, of brilliance. So the whole thing isn't just unstable. It's actively designed to push reality away.
Right, a delusion built on a fantasy. So what keeps it standing when, reality contradicts it constantly?
Confirmation bias. That's the next layer holding it all up. It's like a self-sealing system. This bias acts like this incredibly strong filter. It just screens out anything, evidence, criticism, consequences, doesn't matter, anything that clashes with their story of being perfect. And this whole structure, which feels so solid when you're dealing with them, it's actually built on top of a cognitive deficit.
The deficit being, they just can't see themselves accurately. That's the grandiosity.
Exactly. So when you step into a relationship with them, you're stepping into a system that's structurally like a black hole. It's built entirely on lies and defenses. If you follow the chain, delusion, founded on fantasy, held up by bias, all built on a cognitive deficit. And crucially, the narcissist's internal world, just like the survivors will become post-discard, is introjectively ruled. It's regulated by this constant, desperate need for supply just to keep the whole shaky thing from collapsing.
Okay, now, Vaknin's point about psychosis, this causes a lot of debate. We should probably spend some time clarifying this because most people hear psychosis and think, hearing voices, severe breaks from reality, which narcissists usually don't show.
Yeah, that's really vital context. Vaknin isn't using the typical clinical DSM definition here. It's more of a structural or operational definition of psychosis. He agrees they're rarely clinically psychotic in that classic sense, but he argues they are psychotic because of a fundamental failure in cognition. They literally confuse internal and external objects. They just don't have the structural capacity to reliably tell the difference between what's me and not me, what's inside versus what's outside.
And this confusion, this is what drives projection and introjection.
Yeah.
The two main processes that define the abuse, right?
Precisely. So first, they internalize external objects. They don't relate to actual complex people. They turn people, events, everything into static internal objects, like snapshots. So the partner isn't a dynamic person with their own needs. They're just a function, a role in the narcissist's internal play. The second that partner stops playing that exact role, deviates from the script. Poof. The internal object dies, and the real person becomes totally meaningless to them.
And the second part, the externalizing. That's the part that really devastates the survivor.
This is the contamination mechanism. It's critical. The narcissist externalizes their own internal objects. They basically make the victim carry their rage, their shame they can't bear, their internal conflicts, even that split-off bad mother part inside them. They push all the intolerable, fragmented pieces of themselves out onto the world, and usually, specifically, onto their intimate partner. This structural dumping of unbearable feelings is exactly why the survivor feels so contaminated later, so heavy with guilt that isn't even theirs.
So, by pushing out their own bad stuff, the narcissist gets temporary relief, but the victim pays the price psychologically.
Hmm.
Let's look at the specific kinds of delusions they use. Vaknin outlines 4 main types.
Yeah, four major types that reinforce each other and prop up this false reality. First, you've got the paranoid or persecutory delusion. This is the deep belief that people are conspiring against them, cheating, talking behind their back. Coworkers, family, sometimes even these vague forces.
And structurally, this isn't just feeling sorry for themselves. It actually feeds the grandiosity, doesn't it? Like, if these huge forces are out to get me, I must be incredibly important.
Exactly. They become the heroic victim, the martyr fighting dark forces. It confirms how special they are. The second type is the grandiose or magical delusion.
Mm.
This one's everywhere. The conviction they have some amazing unrecognized talent, maybe even secret powers, or that they're destined to be some major historical figure. This fuels that extreme entitlement. And as the source material points out, this belief holds firm even if objectively they're, complete failures. The fantasy doesn't need reality.
Okay. The third one, the referential delusion. This sounds terrifying because it puts them right at the center of everything happening in the world.
Yeah, this is huge in relationships. It's the belief that totally random, objective things, events, objects, even strangers hold secret messages specifically for them. So if two people laugh across the street, it's definitely about the narcissist. If their partner seems down, it must be because the partner is secretly plotting against them. They are the absolute center point of the universe. Everything revolves around them, either proving how brilliant they are or confirming they're being persecuted.
And the last one, the erotomanic delusion. This seems like it drives that intent idealization at the start.
This is that persistent, totally evidence-proof belief that someone else is madly in love with them. They mistake basic kindness, especially from someone they want, as undeniable proof of love or, a sexual invitation. Vaknin calls it sexual overperception. And this delusion justifies their pursuit, their boundary crossing, and why they absolutely cannot handle rejection. It doesn't compute.
Okay, so if these delusions are often secondary, meaning they're invented after the fact to explain something else, how does that change how we see their defense mechanisms?
Yeah.
It changes the whole picture. The delusion isn't the starting problem, it's the solution. A lot of these narcissistic delusions are secondary. They're invented stories, explanations designed to make sense of, or rather to avoid, unbearable feelings or traumatic memories. Things like childhood abuse, being treated like an object.
So instead of facing the feeling, the shame, the trauma, the mind just creates this big, elaborate, delusional explanation for why they feel that way.
Exactly. They build a delusional context like the world is hostile or everyone's jealous to explain away that internal discomfort, that unease. It's easier than facing the original trauma that caused the internal fragmentation. The source gives that really powerful example, the patient feeling snakes in his bed. That was a secondary delusion explaining a decontextualized physical memory of abuse. The narcissist's mind works just like that. The whole delusional fortress is built to keep the unbearable truth locked away.
And this inherent instability means they're constantly on the verge of collapse, right?
Mm.
So how do they handle everyday stress compared to someone with, say, borderline personality, which is also structurally unstable?
Yeah, the contrast is really telling. When someone with borderline traits faces stress or mood swings, they often react with intense emotional dysregulation, maybe acting out. It's difficult, but it's often aimed at keeping the connection, the relationship object. The narcissist reacts structurally. They get more delusional. They retreat deeper into their fantasy world, their confabulations. They choose the pleasure principle fantasy over reality testing every time. Success is stressful, raises expectations. Failure is stressful, challenges the perfect self. Either way, they tend to dissociate and inflate the delusion.
And this constant need for external regulation, for fantasy fuel, that's why they have to use people, right?
Yeah.
Which leads to that idea of the autoerotic machine. They don't connect, they just consume.
The narcissist is fundamentally an autoerotic machine. That's a key takeaway. They don't engage with others to connect authentically. They engage to consume resources and regulate themselves. Other people become functions, just tools to manage or stabilize their inner emptiness. You, as a survivor, were never loved for who you are. You were tolerated, maybe even prized, for the function you served within their structure. And this need for functions is very systematically organized around the 4S's.
Right, the 4S's. Sex, supplies, services, and safety. These are the main roles survivors get slotted into. Let's break these down because really understanding them helps you see you were never a whole person to them, just a utility.
Okay, starting with sex. In this dynamic, it's almost never about real intimacy or shared pleasure. It's purely autoerotic for the narcissist. The partner is basically objectified, used like a prop in the narcissist's internal movie to confirm their own power, their desirability, how irresistible they are.
That explains so much. Why the sex can feel so intense, maybe even technically skilled, but just completely empty emotionally. Like they're having sex at you, not with you. They're interacting with an internal fantasy object.
Precisely. The partner's only job is to play the role in their fantasy. The
Yeah.
second you try to bring in genuine connection, emotional depth, vulnerability, they pull back, sometimes aggressively, because that threatens the boundary between their internal object and you, the real, complex, demanding external person.
Okay, next is supply.
Yeah.
The absolute lifeblood. And we really need to distinguish between narcissistic supply and that terrifying shift to sadistic supply. The source is called sadistic supply, the engine of collapse.
Yes, that difference is structurally critical. At the start, in the idealization phase, they need narcissistic supply. That's your admiration, your praise, how you mirror back their perfect false self. That validates the construct. But inevitably, the relationship shifts. You start having boundaries, or maybe you just can't perfectly mirror them anymore. That's when they switch, often brutally, to needing sadistic supply.
And what does that switch achieve for them structurally? Why feed on pain?
They feed off your pain, your confusion, your tears, your collapse, even your self-blame. It feels cruel because it is, but it's also functionally essential for them. Why? Because it proves their absolute power and control over your reality, your emotions. When you're falling apart and blaming yourself, it structurally validates their narrative that they are perfect and you are the defective one. It protects their core delusion from shattering. Your breakdown becomes their proof of innocence.
Wow. So they actually need the victim to be stable enough initially so they can enjoy breaking them down later, which means if you become calm or go silent, you're cutting off that sadistic supply line.
Absolutely. The engine just stalls,
Okay, the third S is services. This is pure instrumentalization.
reducing you to a tool completely. The narcissist sees your time, your energy, your work, your emotional soothing, housekeeping, money, whatever it is, as their absolute right. Not a gift, not a contribution, a right. You exist as a function to regulate their internal world. So if you fail to provide that service, maybe you get sick, you have your own needs, you're just busy, you're instantly attacked or devalued, possibly discarded, because the tool has stopped working.
And the last one, safety. There's a real contradiction here, isn't there?
Yeah.
They want safety, but they create chaos.
They crave control over abandonment. That's the core. They demand constant reassurance. They want you nearby. But at the same time, they create incredible chaos. They constantly provoke fights, push your boundaries, test you, almost daring you to leave. It's like they want you close enough to be a comfort blanket, but not so close you might actually see the fragmentation inside them. Safety for them really means having complete dominance over if, when, and how the relationship ends. They must be the one in control of the collapse.
And all these uses, the four S's, they're all attempts to manage something internal, right? Something that went wrong very early on. Which brings us back to the maternal split.
Yes, this is really the foundation the whole pathology is built on. The narcissist carries this split internal image of the mother figure, and by extension, pretty much everyone else. One part is the ideal, perfect, all-giving, soothing mother. The other part is the bad, cold, rejecting, maybe even terrifying mother figure. And the key thing is, the narcissist cannot integrate these two opposing images into one realistic, whole person. Because integration would mean admitting imperfection, both in the mother and, crucially, in themselves.
And because they can't stand having that bad part inside them, they have to push it out onto someone else.
Immediately. And that's where the survivor comes in. You get installed into this impossible dual role. You have to be the good mother, the perfect mirror, the source of fantasy regulation, the endless supply tap. But inevitably, you also become the bad mother, the one who fails, who rejects, even just by having needs, the source of their narcissistic injury.
So the survivor becomes the container for the narcissist's own unresolved, split-off trauma with their earliest caregiver. The moment you try to be a real, flawed human being, you automatically fail the good mother test and get instantly recast as the bad mother. And that triggers the devaluation, the cruelty, and eventually the discard.
And that's the exact moment the external structure you are providing fails them, and the real contagion, the transfer of that internal structure to you, begins in earnest.
Okay, so this is where MPIT comes in, providing that framework for what happens next to the survivor. The source calls narcissistic abuse structurally contagious, like a virus replicating. What does that mean if the survivor actually internalizes the narcissist structure?
The implications are huge. It means the narcissist's disorganized inner world, that split mother structure, the chaos gets externalized into the relationship dynamics. And the survivor, through that intense idealization phase, through trying so hard to comply, actually internalizes that structure. They
Okay.
start adopting the abuser's way of thinking, their emotional logic, sometimes even their apathy, their repetitive ways of relating. The collapse isn't just about missing someone, it's an epistemic annihilation. The very framework you use to understand yourself, love, reality, it gets overwritten by the narcissist's logic.
And the specific moment that signals the collapse of this shared, albeit false, reality,
Yeah.
that's gaze collapse. Can you explain that moment when the mirror just goes dark?
Gaze collapse is that critical point of derecognition. It's the sudden, total withdrawal of the narcissist's attention, their focus, what MPIT calls their energetic cathexis. Now, this gaze, even though it's external, it functions structurally as the main anchor for the survivor's self-worth, their ego stability during the relationship. The narcissist looking at you, idealizing you, basically made you feel real within their fantasy world.
And when that gaze suddenly disappears,
The anchor is just cut, gone. It's a symbolic annihilation of that shared fantasy. And it leads to this catastrophic shattering of the temporary self-structure the survivor built based on that borrowed reflection. You're not just rejected, you're made unseen, structurally unmade. And the mind just cannot process this erasure because the entire sense of self had become organized around being seen by that very specific, intense gaze.
okay, so the anchor's gone, the psyche's adrift, and then it starts to flip inward, leading to reflexive mirrored psychic inversion, RMPI.
Yeah.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The survivor essentially becomes their own internal abuser.
Yeah. RMPI is that devastating structural collapse where the ego turns on itself. It starts replicating the exact narcissistic dynamic, but internally. The survivor begins attacking themselves from the inside. They can't tell the difference between their own authentic voice and the narcissist's implanted critical voice, what MPIT calls the interject enforcer. This is that internal war people describe, often mistaken for just really bad self-esteem. But structurally, the survivor is running the narcissistic script on themselves because, in the wreckage, that's the only relational pattern left standing.
And MPIT brings in this really radical idea. The survivor develops their own defensive structure, the false protector. How is this different from the narcissist's false self?
It's fundamentally different in its purpose. The survivor forms this pseudo-false self, the false protector, not out of grandiosity or a need to manipulate. Structurally, its function is to remain visible either to the actual abuser or, later, to the internalized abuser, the interject. It's about mediating the unbearable chaos. It's this adaptive, compliant persona, constantly scanning for threats, trying desperately to achieve the impossible perfection the narcissist demanded, just to survive, just to keep some kind of connection, even a toxic one.
But okay, once the narcissist is physically gone, why does this false protector stick around and start punishing the real self, the grieving self?
Because its core function was always object maintenance, keeping the connection, preventing total abandonment by the bad object. When the external narcissist leaves, that internal system, that programming is still active. The false protector, which is geared towards compliance, self-sacrifice, and perfectionism, now looks at the authentic, hurting, grieving self and judges it, sees it as weak, failing, not good enough, unworthy of surviving. It becomes the internal enforcer of the narcissist's impossible standards, keeping the survivor trapped in that psychological prison long after the jailer has left.
And Vaknin's concept of interject co-option, that explains why that critical voice feels so much like us, why the self-blame feels so real and justified.
Exactly. These interjects aren't just memories, they are active, functional command structures. They're the voices, the values, the narratives the narcissist literally installed in you. They're designed to hijack and override your own authentic voice, your own perceptions. They recast all your experiences through the narcissist's distorted self-serving logic. So, for example, the survivor thinks, maybe I should try dating again. And immediately, the interject enforcer pops up. See? You're just needy. You can't be alone. You only want supply, just like they always said.
That's incredibly insidious. The interject enforcer isn't just being critical, it's acting like an internal tyrant, using the language of morality and judgment to make sure the survivor keeps carrying the shame and guilt the narcissist dumped on them.
Precisely. The interject enforcer ensures the survivor stays locked in that internal role, the bad mother, the defective object, long after the relationship is over. It keeps the collapse going recursively, forcing the survivor to hold on to those hated, fragmented parts the narcissist successfully expelled from themselves.
Right, this brings us to the absolute core of the collapse experience. The sources are really clear. This isn't just emotional pain, it's configurational disintegration. The whole scaffolding of the ego is coming down. We're talking about the mind entering a temporary, really profound state of breakdown.
Yes, and we really need to spend time here. This is crucial. The survivor's mind, having been systematically fractured by being forced into that dual good-bad object role, now enters this liminal breakdown state. MPIT gives it a name: collapse-induced psychotic regression, CIPR. Now, it's really, really important to stress this is not permanent clinical psychosis like schizophrenia. It's a temporary, though profound, regression. The survivor basically loses symbolic coherence, the ability to make sense of things because of that derecognition, that gaze collapse, and just this flood of uncontained emotion.
What does that actually feel like? What are the main symptoms of CIPR that show this structural breakdown?
Well, the loss of symbolic coherence is primary. It's devastating. Survivors often report things like severe temporal distortion, like they feel they've been cycling through terror and shame for days, maybe a week, but they look at the clock and only 20 minutes have actually passed. Their reality testing is just shot because the external anchor, the narcissist's gaze, is gone, and the internal landscape is pure chaos.
It sounds like the mind is desperately scrambling to create some kind of reality, even a distorted one, just to survive the feeling of void, of non-existence.
That's exactly it. CIPR generates what MPIT calls the paracosm of collapse. This is like a fully formed internal symbolic world, a bubble reality. The paracosm is where the survivor lives inside the narcissist's inverted relational rules. They're constantly replaying scenes, reanalyzing conversations, basically hallucinating themselves through the narcissist's critical, rejecting perspective. It's a psychological prison constructed entirely from the narcissist's leftover materials, their logic, their demands, where the survivor tries impossibly to fix the unfixable relationship by running the entire collapse scenario internally, over and over.
And what keeps that internal hamster wheel spinning? That's inverse mirrored reflexive apathy, IMRA. How does that work?
IMRA is the engine that drives the recursive nature of the collapse. After the gaze collapse, the survivor keeps running the shared fantasy internally, but now it's in reverse. They essentially become their own internal narcissist. They replay the coldness, the emotional deadness, the rejection, the impossible standards, the unfulfillable longing, but it's all directed inward, at themselves.
So you're not just grieving the loss, you're actively performing the abuser's emotional stance towards yourself inside your own head.
Yes, it's an effective vacuum. The structural warmth, even though it was fake, the illusion of intimacy from the shared fantasy gets yanked away. What's left is IMRA, this profound emotional deadness directed inwards. And this is what feels so much like guilt or responsibility. It tricks the survivor into thinking, I must have caused this, or I must be fundamentally bad, because they are mirroring the narcissist's internal apathy and directing it at their own core self.
Which leads us straight to maybe the most critical parallel. The survivor is literally housing the narcissist's own internal splits. The source says the survivor doesn't become the narcissist, but becomes the narcissist's discarded internal object. What exactly is in that object?
This is the absolute crux of MPIT, I think. The narcissist, because they cannot integrate their own fragmented, hated, persecutory parts, that original bad object from the maternal split. They systematically project those parts into the survivor, especially during the devaluation phase. Then, when the discard happens, the narcissist walks away, but the projection is complete. The survivor is left holding the bag, housing this implanted bad object.
And this implanted thing,
Yeah.
what does it generate internally for the survivor?
Overwhelming, corrosive, completely irrational shame and terror. This is the deep, deep root of that agonizing thought, oh my God, maybe I was the narcissist all along. What the survivor is actually experiencing is the internal persecution, the self-hatred that the narcissist managed to avoid by dumping it onto them. The sheer intensity of this self-loathing is, ironically, the proof that the survivor is not the narcissist. They are the innocent host carrying the narcissist's internal enemy. The narcissist can't feel that level of self-hatred precisely because they successfully externalized it. The survivor is now feeling it for both of them.
And the ego collapsing under CIPR isn't neat. It fragments. Different parts of the self seem to revert to really early developmental stages, like infancy.
Yes, the ego shatters into parts, and these parts often align with very early developmental positions. First, you often see the emergence of the mute child. This is the silenced, deeply traumatized core self. This reflects a regression towards the psychotic position, a pre-verbal state of sheer terror, where symbolic understanding breaks down. The core self feels utterly unseen, unable to even articulate what's happening or what it needs.
Then you have the parts that were trying to cope, the defensive parts that kept the relationship going somehow.
Right. The false protector, or sometimes called the redeemer. This part embodies more of a borderline or dependent position. It's that defensive compliant front that was desperately trying to maintain the connection, even a toxic one. It reflects that primal, dependent need to conform to survive, to avoid total abandonment. This is the part that might still be trying to function, manage things externally, even after the relationship's over, running on those old rules.
And the third part is that weaponized internal voice.
That's the introject enforcer, the punishing internal critic. This reflects the introjected, rejecting bad object structure. It operates more from a neurotic position driven by anxiety, guilt, trying to control the chaos through obsessive thinking, rumination, self-attack. It's a mechanism of internal punishment and control.
And what's driving this terrifying fragmentation, this plunge back into infantile states? MPIT connects it to the anticipatory stress reflex, ASR system going haywire.
Yeah, the ASR model helps explain the sheer speed and severity of the collapse. ASR is like this pre-conscious gateway that organizes our emotional responses to threat. During the relationship, the survivor was likely stuck in ASR 3, which is about false compliance, performance, trying desperately to manage the situation and maintain the fantasy. When the symbolic structure collapses, when the gaze vanishes, when ASR 3 fails because there's nothing left to comply with, the mind doesn't just step down neatly. It spirals violently backwards to the most primitive setting. ASR 1. Dissolution.
ASR 1. That's primal terror territory.
It's the absolute primal, preconscious state of effective collapse. It's rooted in the earliest developmental terror, the fear of non-existence, of being totally misrecognized and therefore literally unmade, dissolving into nothing. The survivor feels like they're actually disintegrating because the external anchor that confirmed their existence has been ripped away so brutally. So the collapse itself, inhabiting that horrific inverted paracosm, becomes a perverse kind of structural defense. The mind would rather live inside the familiar horror of the narcissist's structure than face the terror of ontological non-existence.
Okay, we've mapped the contamination, the structure of the devastation. How does someone start to climb out? How do you reclaim your own mind, your own structure, and get out of that paracosm? First step seems to be realizing the void wasn't yours.
That recognition is absolutely step one in pulling your energy back. That profound emptiness the survivor feels swirling inside them. It isn't their personal flaw or lack. It was the narcissist's internal absence, their own chronic emptiness that you mistook for depth or intensity or intimacy. Healing has to start with withdrawing your focus, your libidinal energy from that absence, and fully, radically accepting that the relationship wasn't just bad or flawed. It was structurally, ontologically, a simulation. It wasn't real in the way you thought.
Which means healing isn't just about managing emotions, feeling better. It's a structural job, a philosophical one almost. Restoring symbolic authorship.
Symbolic authorship, yes. It's the radical refusal to keep performing the narcissist script inside your own head. It's the process of reclaiming your fundamental ability to narrate your own experience with coherence, with integrity, with reference only to yourself, not the abuser. It means shifting yourself from being a simulated object in their drama back to being a perceiving, active subject in your own life. That's the hard work. Building a new internal structure that is completely independent of needing the abuser's gaze real or remembered for validation.
And a huge part of that authorship is identifying and then dismantling that internal tyrant, the interject enforcer. How do you actually silence that voice or override it?
First, you have to externalize it. Name it. Recognize that voice is not me. You have to consciously separate the voice from the self. Remember, the introject isn't just a bad memory. It's an active, living command structure inside you. So you start tracking it. When does it speak up? What are its favorite lines? What commands does it issue? And then you have to actively challenge its narrative. You say, no, that shame isn't mine. That's their logic, their projection that I was forced to carry. Or, I don't owe guilt for surviving this. I was manipulated into carrying their fragmentation. It's like performing a symbolic exorcism, deliberately moving that borrowed psychological weapon out of the driver's seat of your ego.
This sounds like incredibly difficult, painstaking work, but it leads toward MPIT's ultimate goal. Vertical authorship. What does that look like? That final reintegration.
Vertical authorship is about moving out of the loop. The horizontal spin cycle of collapse and repetition, that endless rumination inside the paracosm. It's about finding your own internal vertical axis, your own ground. It's about recognizing that your true self was never actually destroyed. It was silenced, buried, misrecognized, but it's still there. So you start reclaiming your own gaze, your own perspective on yourself. You reclaim your story, your voice. You allow that mute child part to finally speak its truth. You start integrating those fragmented pieces back into a more cohesive whole. whole, you allow the false protector to finally stand down because the primal threat of non-existence of ASR1 terror has been faced and
You
metabolized.
stop asking, am I real? And you're just,
You stop being a function in someone else's system and become the origin point of your own. Hashtag Outark Outro. So, okay, what does all this really mean? For you, the listener, if you're in the thick of that post-discard hell right now, the sheer complexity, the depth of the confusion you feel, the CIPR, the IMRA, that intense crippling shame that feels like it's yours but isn't, that doesn't prove there's something wrong with you, it actually proves you were the innocent host. You were dealing with a highly organized, structurally contagious psychic system. The pain, the fragmentation, the feeling of symbolic death. It's all evidence that a massive systemic lie is finally breaking down inside you. You survived the collapse of a false reality.
that structural reframe is so important. The collapse wasn't your failure. It was the inevitable implosion of a system built entirely on delusion, projection, and control. The survivor's real strength isn't just in moving on. It's in the radical, incredibly brave act of structurally rewriting the symbolic reality they were forced into. You literally reclaim the pen. You become the author again.
You reclaim existence itself, piece by painful, fragmented, beautiful piece.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of collapse and exploring that challenging but absolutely essential path back to symbolic authorship. Keep being the author of your own reality.